the cooperative strategy, which would be to work through COVAX. And this is the one that maximizes social welfare. So what are the arguments for trying to change this game? Well, first thing to recognize is that it is most of the money to finance the vaccines has come from the public sector, either by direct subsidy or by these advanced purchase agreements. And there's that example that I gave earlier, but the US, for example, had an advanced purchase agreement with AstraZeneca for 1.2 billion in exchange for 300 million doses. They were taking a gamble on whether that vaccine would be successful. Public funding strengthens the case for patent waiver, but the most compelling case is that the waiver needs to be made to meet global demand. But a waiver is not enough, actually, because this graph shows production. The production is shown, manufacturing capacity is shown in the black box, and the orders are shown in the pink, in the grey, sort of orange and pink shaded boxes for low, middle and high income countries. And those orders, the manufacturing capacity is not yet there to meet those orders. So there's a timing issue around this. It's actually worse than this graph represents, because some of these orders are not due to 2022. So if another strategy would be to do something slightly different, not just have the multilateral COVAX agreement. We've got that, it's not working that well. I mean, it's working, but it could be extended. Waive patents and transfer and build technology. And that would increase the absolute value of these pale stones doesn't matter. It's just a relative structure. That would increase social welfare and speed up diffusion. So there are other ways of stimulating innovation and dynamic efficiency. Government investment in R&D, patent prizes, trade secrets is something companies use all the time. But building capabilities that are hard to reproduce is another one. And multilateral investment in R&D pools is a further one that we see being used in COVAX. It's just that we need to up that game and expand manufacturing capacity. So we would argue very strongly in favour of immediately waiving patent laws whenever the WHO declares a pandemic or the highest level of emergency, as it did back in beginning of 2020. We shouldn't be having to wait 18 months. We still don't have the patent waiver. We can encourage local authorities, as Damien said, to invent around existing patents, modify AstraZeneca to get rid of the side effects and so on. Open innovation, patent pledges and commons, and strengthening COVAX. And really a new international accord that is grounded on regional innovation systems theory to transfer technology and build innovation and manufacturing capacity is essential. And I've done a short piece on that. And I noticed actually last week, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the IMF have called for exactly more international cooperation. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both Damien and Christine, for such an interesting talk. I wonder if there are any questions from either other panelists or any of the attendees. If you go down to your screen, you can either raise your hand or just unmute and chip in, if you can unmute and chip in. Not quite sure what features are available in this particular format. Do we have any questions? I'm never quite sure how long to leave for questions, because it takes a bit of time for everyone to kind of get their hands together and unmuted and things. I think there's one question that occurred to me, is that I think you make an interesting economic argument. What would be the ways of kind of trying to help essentially turn this into a kind of political argument? Because it's hard to make an argument saying that I mean, the logic of it is fine to those that are familiar with the logic, but it's hard when you've got people who say, but we should look after our own first. How do you see that argument sort of being translated effectively? Or maybe not. Christine.
Do you want to have a go at that, Damon, or do you want? I don't mind having a go at answering it. I mean, it's exactly this debate that we see in the UK today about face masks, and it's, you know, I think people do understand it, but it does just need to be explained that, you know, when you wear a face mask individually, it gives you very little protection actually, because the masks are permeable. Most of the masks are permeable, and they don't have the right level of filtration to prevent infection. That's not true for the medical quality masks, but for the masks that most people wear, they're not that strong. The protection comes from everyone wearing a mask. You know, it's a collective action problem, and that just needs to be explained to people. You know, you don't wear the mask yourself primarily. I mean, it will help you, but if everyone wears a mask and everyone's protected, and it's that just getting across that difference, which is, you know, one of the strengths actually of game theory, that it does show that you end up with outcomes that are not in the collective interest. But I think because that argument involves two steps, it needs to be explained, and that's what's not being done. The messaging is not right. I mean, I think, you know, if we look at Stephen Reicher, I think his name is, from University of Edinburgh, behavioural psychologist, you know, he just says the messaging has got to be improved. I agree.
Yeah. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I did see one very nice, it was a mask with printed on it, "My mask protects you, your mask protects me," which I thought was kind of quite a nice message to keep kind of pushing out. So thank you very much to Christine, Joanna, Vanessa and Damien for that talk. We're now going to turn to Professor Lawrence Harris. Lawrence will be known to many of you, and Lawrence is going to talk now about recovering from COVID-19, some of the economic scenarios for South Africa. So Lawrence, are you okay to?
I am. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Ben, and also for Pasquale's kind introduction. I'm going to need some technical advice from you, Ben, just to share my screen. Okay, I click on the share screen button at the bottom.
Yeah, and then hopefully you should be able to see something or other that says PowerPoint. One of the little windows that's available.
It doesn't actually say that. That was why I was curious.
Have you got your PowerPoint loaded up? I mean,
yes, do have, yeah. You know, my PowerPoint slides are loaded up. They're on the screen behind the Zoom screen, but I can't get them onto the.
If you can drop the file into the chat, if you feel happy doing that.
Yes, I can do that.
If you can drag and drop it into the chat, then I can present it for you if you wish.
Gosh, that seems like a phenomenal service.
Lawrence, you know I'm always at your service.
Gosh, that's even more terrifying. Actually, I'm going to struggle with this. Okay, so I shall.
Wherever you saved it, if you just drag it into the text box.
Yeah.
And you can either do it just to me or to everyone, or. And then with luck.
I'm going to suggest, if it's all right with you, that you go straight to the next paper while I make sure that I get this. I don't waste anybody's time.
Let's do that. So I'm not going to say we're going to park Lawrence, because that would be disrespectful to him. But Bassam, would you be all right to step in at this moment?
Sure, happy to. Let me see if I can share my screen.
Thank you. So just to introduce to colleagues and also to those attending, this Professor Bassam Fatou, who's a colleague at SOAS, and he's going to be talking about the diversification strategy under deep uncertainty for Middle East and North Africa oil exporting countries. So Bassam, I'll let you kind of lead off. Okay.
Thank you. Ben, for the kind introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be joining you today. What I will try to do is to divide my presentation into two parts. In the first part, I will discuss what I think are the main features of the current energy transition. And in the second part, I will focus on the strategies that oil exporters can adopt to deal with the repercussions of the transition to a low emissions path. But before diving into that discussion, let me start with a couple of observations. The first one is that if one looks at the data, it shows that oil rents have brought massive economic benefits to oil exporters, and this is reflected in most socioeconomic development degrees. But the second observation is also quite relevant, is that the heavy reliance on oil revenues has also created its own economic and institutional challenges. The instability and volatility of oil revenues contributed to macroeconomic stability and very volatile economic growth, but also more widely, the distribution of oil rents contributed to very weak institutional environment and many economic distortions. One can think about a weak private sector, which is over dependent on government spending, very rigid labor markets, inefficiencies and subsidies, which tend to distort production and consumption decisions. And usually this is reflected in relatively weak economic growth and declining GDP per capita over time for many oil exporters. And these challenges are becoming much more pronounced as the prospects for oil demand are becoming more uncertain due to the energy transition and decarbonization policies. And also some believe that the Covid-19 will accelerate the energy transition and will have a big impact on oil demand looking forward. I don't have my own oil demand projections, but I can make few observations when looking at this aspect. The first one is that the oil demand projections are extremely sensitive to the underlying assumptions of the model, whether that's economic growth, population growth, the assumptions you made about the transformation in the transport sector, the assumptions you use about global carbon tax. And by changing these assumptions, one really can push the peak of oil demand forward or backward, actually, by decades. And also, it very much depends on the purpose of the exercise, whether it's forecasting or backcasting, because many of the exercises, they'd like, let's say, to reach net zero by 2050, and then they tend to work their way backward, trying to identify different transition paths. So they are not really forecasts. And most of the scenarios tend to predict a unique global peak, after which oil demand declines sharply after reaching that unique peak. So they do not allow for the possibility of multiple peaks or oil demand actually plateauing. And there is really no consensus on many of the underlying assumptions. Some of the projections are based on historical trends, which show that fast energy transition in energy system has rarely happened, whether other projections are based on the idea that this transition is unique, it's about fighting climate change, it's driven by government policy. I would say that there are a few features of the energy transition which are, at least to me, which I think are quite important in determining how oil exporters need to adapt their transition policies. The first one is that the speed of the energy transition is highly uncertain. The second one, I would say, is that the transition is not likely to be uniform across the globe. And the third one is that the transition will not be linear. It could be disruptive, it could be subject to setbacks. And the final observation, that I don't believe there is going to be a single transition path across the globe. But regardless of what you think about the speed of the energy transition, the impacts are already being felt. Perceptions of players and players' behaviors have been shifting much faster than the actual changes in the energy mix. And in a way, they're already shaping the energy industry and some key decisions. For instance, in terms of finance, they're affecting the investors' risk preference, affecting financing costs and availability of finance for some of the hydrocarbon projects. And in terms of the players, for instance, if you look at the international oil companies, they're adapting their strategies. They are incorporating climate-related objectives into their strategies. They're trying to reduce the share of oil assets in their portfolios. They're increasing the share of gas and renewables. And most of them, or the majority of them, have announced ambitious targets to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Now, the challenges facing the oil exporters are much, much graver, and that has to do with at least two observations. First of all, the proved reserves to production ratios extend for multiple decades, especially when you compare it to international oil companies. So they face the challenge of monetizing a very large reserve base. And the second observation, of course, is that these countries can experience a risk of loss in export revenues, which could disrupt their socioeconomic well-being, given the heavy reliance of their economies on oil revenues. So the key question to my mind is really what adaptation strategies should oil exporters pursue, given that they have a lot of political and domestic economic constraints, an energy transition which is changing the prospects of oil demand, but at the same time whose speed is uncertain and whose impact is not uniform across the globe. And at the same time, we are seeing perceptions and policies are changing fast. Now, of course, the most effective strategy which has been recommended for this oil exporter to diversify away from the oil and gas sector. But there are real challenges to realize meaningful diversification, particularly fiscal diversification, because diversification is only successful if you are able to produce uncorrelated income streams through creating new sectors or through taxation, direct or indirect. Also diversification into different areas away from your core competitive advantage than the risk of failing to establish viable non-resource export sectors. And of course, to have meaningful diversification, this requires structural reforms, building human capital, improving the education system, improving the business environment, transparency and governance, and removing barriers to the private sector participation. And I would argue that there is a big uncertainty about how quickly or even whether such extensive economic and social reforms can be implemented in most oil and gas exporting countries. On top of that as well, one has to realize as well that the oil and gas sector remains very profitable and still enjoys higher margins, especially when compared to the new industries that these governments are trying to establish. Also, the reduced investment flow into the oil and gas sector can cause supply to fall faster than demand in certain periods, resulting in even higher margins, at least for short periods of time. Also, these governments can leverage on the oil and gas revenue to ease the pain of the reforms that are required for diversification. So exiting too early from such an established strategic sector deprives the countries from an important source of income and the key source of competitive advantage. So that's why, suggestions for oil and gas exporters to move away from this sector, I would argue they are both unrealistic and actually not even optimal as well. So the question, the next question is that if diversifying from the oil and gas sector is suboptimal and it cannot be achieved at a rapid pace, so the question is how to enhance the competitiveness and increase the resilience of the hydrocarbon sector in a world that is transitioning towards net zero emissions. And here there are various policies that one could look at. One thing that the oil exporters can do is that they can compete on costs, and they can actually take measures even to improve the efficiency of production and lower these costs even further. The other alternative is to adapt to faster monetization strategies, what is known in the literature as the green paradox, is basically try to exploit the reserves as quickly as possible and put them in the market. The problem with those strategies is that the lack of fiscal diversification and the high social costs of production acts as a constraint on this strategy. Because what happens if you increase supply in the face of slowing demand, this would result in lower revenues, at least in the short term. In the long term, that might push high cost producers out of the market, but for that strategy to work, that will take longer time. The other challenge with this strategy is that some importing countries may decide to implement high carbon taxes. And this would create a wedge between the revenues generated by the oil and gas exporters and the revenues generated by consuming countries, with plenty of evidence in the literature showing that the oil importing countries can capture a big part of the rent in this way. The other strategy which oil and gas exporters can also adopt is to diversify within the energy sector itself, for instance, into energy-intensive industries such as petrochemical, steel, cement, and fertilizers, where they have a competitive advantage. And that could create a wider range of higher value products and could provide some hedge against price volatility. But the problem again is that the heavy industrialization into energy-intensive industries increases the domestic emissions of greenhouse gases. And again, as we are seeing a trend that EU might start, but it might extend to the rest of the world, is that importers might develop policies to account for the carbon content of the final goods of, let's say, steel, petrochemical, cement, and they could apply again border carbon adjustment measures and capture part of the rent. That's why I would argue that the oil exporters have to compete on dimensions other than cost and by reducing emissions. And this could be done in different ways. Of course, they can invest in renewables and integrate renewables with the existing hydrocarbon infrastructure to reduce emissions in the production, and that's already basically happening. They can also, by investing in renewables, they can improve the efficiency of the domestic use of energy and optimize the energy mix. They can, on top of that, implement energy efficiency programs, energy pricing reforms, and try to change the energy mix towards gas and renewables. And that could achieve multiple objectives. But the fundamental problem remains that the margins in renewables are quite thin and cannot substitute for the rents generated by the hydrocarbon sector. And that is why it's quite important that exporters could work towards ensuring that their production process and core hydrocarbon products can compete on the emissions front. And that involves reducing emission in the production process, what is known as Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and in the consumption of gas and products derived from the crude and natural gas, what is known as Scope 3 emissions. Now, for many of the oil and gas exporters, particularly those in the Gulf, Scope 1 and Scope 2 are much easier to achieve because of the relative position, because of the quality of their crude, which is low carbon content, because of the investment they have done in reducing gas flaring and ethane emissions. But at the end of the day, the real challenge really lies in reducing emissions from the consumption of final products. And that is why, it's quite important to look at the new concepts. For instance, concepts like the circular carbon economy. But to me, the most important element is how to establish certain technologies, particularly the CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And that's, I think, is an area where many of the oil exporters could have competitive advantage. They are able to maintain oil and gas in the energy mix for longer. They can even increase the competitiveness of their energy-intensive industries. And actually, that could also lead to further integration of the energy sector, because if you think that they can utilize the carbon CO2 emissions from the energy-intensive industries, using them, let's say, in enhanced oil recovery in order to increase the productivity of their current activities. And at the end of the day, even from a global perspective, CCUS, for instance, is an essential to reduce emissions from hard-to-abate sector and reaching net zero targets. Most of the models basically shows that this is a technology which is needed in order to reach our net zero targets. Nevertheless, despite the fact that it's a strategic interest for oil and gas exporters to lead on the carbon sink mitigation strategies, what we see is that most of the CCUS projects are located in OECD countries, and most of the support schemes are mostly developed in OECD countries. And to me, from an oil exporter perspective, the investment in CCUS, it's true that it lowers the return compared to existing strategy of just exporting unabated oil and gas. But the way I see that this cost is actually vital in order to improve the resilience of the energy sector. But at the same time, shifting all the cost to oil and gas exporters, I don't think this is viable, especially if the cost is too high. especially if you take into account that producing countries are likely to be the most affected by the transition. And there's going to be a competition for very limited funds to go into other sectors. So that's why it's very important to look at burden sharing mechanisms, and this should be developed in order to allow a much more inclusive path. And there are many ways to do this. These are areas that I'm looking at into the moment. For instance, through the wellhead carbon taxes, CCS clubs, carbon storage units. And what is quite interesting is that all of these, it could be developed within the multilateral framework and within the Paris Climate Agreement. So just to conclude, some exporters are willing to be part of the solution and lead on initiatives to fight climate change. And we should be encouraging this trend, but there must be a recognition of their national circumstances, that there will be various transition paths depending on starting points, core competencies, and existing assets. And sometimes the insistence on a single path, I would argue that this would delay the transition. And that actually could not enable the use of the technical and financial resources of some of the producers. It can perpetuate non-cooperative behavior, and actually it can increase the cost of the transition. And that's why it's important to not, to avoid frameworks that discriminate against certain technologies or fuels and allow technologies to compete, and not shift the cost to oil and gas producers alone. And that's why the importance of developing burden sharing mechanism and integrate them into multilateral and bilateral framework. That's not to say that the oil and gas exporting countries should not take leadership in mitigation technologies. And actually they need to do that, but I think that would enable them if it's done within a multilateral framework which allows for some burden sharing mechanisms. So that's all from me, Ben. Thank you again, and I look forward to answering if there's any question.
Thanks very much indeed, Bassam. Colleagues, any questions for Bassam? Any observations that people would like to make? I have to apologize, Bassam, my internet fell over halfway through, so I missed a crucial chunk, so I do apologize for that.
Not at all. Anyway, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
We'll give people a second or two. Lawrence, you're now screen sharing.
Oh, that's nice.
Okay, if we haven't any further questions, just because time's getting a little tighter, if it's all right with you, Bassam, we'll move on to Lawrence if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks, Bassam. So Lawrence now is Professor Lawrence Harris, who's going to talk about recovering from COVID-19, the various economic scenarios for South Africa. Lawrence, do you want to share, or would you like me to, or are you happy to do?
It's probably easier if I do, because then I can control the clicks.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Not least because my internet's not everything it could be.
So, Ben, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you very much indeed for the technological help, which I'll just go to slideshow, I hope.
Play from start, I think, over on the left.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If you go and click on home, Lawrence.
Yeah,
wait,
sure.
Sorry, actually, if you click on slideshow, I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
Click on slideshow and it'll bring that ribbon up again.
Yeah.
That's it.
And
then go over to the far left.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Play from start, yeah. And then you're there.
We're there. Right. Again, thank you again, Ben, for the technology. Right, but I shan't waste any more time and simply say thank you very much indeed for arranging this session. It's a great honour to be part of it, and I'd like to go straight into just presenting this. This report's on work that we've been doing in South Africa on first of all the impact of and secondly, recovering from the first lockdown of COVID-19. The first COVID wave in South Africa led to the government imposing a severe lockdown in March 2020. Within 10 days, my colleagues and I had modeled the likely effects of the lockdown. And what we did was we calculated the direct and indirect effects, both the direct and the indirect effects on output, employment and incomes. And we showed the negative effects of the lockdown as being uneven across 62 sectors. We also demonstrated that the negative effects on GDP and income inequality would be modified by social transfer payments. South Africa has a very strong system, a long-standing strong system of social transfer payments, including pensions and other forms. What we did was not produce forecasts, we produced simulation estimates. And our estimates turned out to be very close to the subsequent actual economic changes. The modelling that we did then in April 2020 informed the government's emergency budget that it instituted immediately after the lockdown. When restrictions were then loosened, recovery towards pre-lockdown GDP was rapid, but not complete. The papers on those uneven effects of the first wave lockdown are those that we published. We've now gone beyond that. As I say, the recovery has been partial and unequal. So now what we've been doing is modeling the recovery policies. The recovery has by itself been partial and unequal. Some industrial sectors have remained significantly worse than the pre-COVID shock, and so have household employment and income in some quintiles. So what we've done is we've recalculated our model to estimate the effects that different policy packages that could be adopted during the recovery period, what different policy packages to support the recovery would have, what would be their effects. In this paper that I'm referring to at the top of the page there, top of the slide there, in this paper, we modeled the effects of the policies during the recovery with a focus upon two dimensions. One is to what extent could the policy scenarios stimulate the economy sector by sector, and that's important. Our modeling focuses upon disaggregated economy, disaggregated by sectors. And in addition, what effect could it have on protecting the income of the poor? So let me just describe some features of the uneven recovery taking us to that has occurred up to the first quarter of this year. Well, first of all, and the thing is just concentrated on the pictures, GDP fell by more than employment, but it did recover faster. We're measuring passage of time along there, and here we're measuring deviation from the 2019 average levels of GDP employment. The yellow bars are GDP, the grey bars are employment. I should say that before the COVID lockdown, South Africa's economy was extremely weak anyway. There had been stagnation, as you can see, sort of growth in the first quarter of 2020 was nil, and for 3 years before that had been pretty well nil. That recovery between the lockdown of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, there was a recovery. But what our interest was to look at how that recovery affected individual sectors. Here are some of the main sectors that we're looking at: construction, manufacturing, mining, transport. Construction was badly hit. Manufacturing was, the grey line tells you how badly hit the sectors were by lockdown, and multicolored ones thereafter show you the improvement or how badly, how much that negative effect was reduced in subsequent quarters. The recovery in agriculture, agriculture has not been badly hit, and it continued to be strong. Some sectors were badly hit. For example, trade was badly hit, but made a fast recovery. Electricity was quite badly hit, but made a fast recovery. Public services were badly hit, but made a very fast recovery. However, construction was badly hit and did not make a fast recovery. Manufacturing was quite badly hit and recovered much faster than expected. Transport was badly hit, but did not recover fast. So our interest was the unevenness of the recovery. And here, this shows the unevenness within the manufacturing sector. I'm not going to read off the different sectoral, the 45 manufacturing sectors that we've listed there. But you can see that there's a great variation in their path. So the question that faced us was, in the light of all that unevenness, could policy intervention to assist the recovery, could it assist vulnerable households and promote recovery sector by sector? What we did was in our model, we ran several scenarios. We said, okay, well, one type of scenario would be a straightforward income support scenario of increasing transfers to households. And we looked at two ways of increasing social transfers to households. One is full intervention. That means to expand the existing income support, which includes pensions, unemployment insurance, child support grants, and also the COVID-specific relief. This COVID-specific relief is shown here. This is the special grants that came in with the budget that was introduced during the lockdown, the emergency budget. So as you can see, the sums that had been being dispersed under all of these were substantial sums, and COVID support relief added about 25% to the existing forms of social transfers, pensions, child benefit, and so on. So the first scenario was, could we expand the existing levels of social transfers in total? And the second scenario was to have transfers to households as a reduced intervention, which only expanded the COVID-specific social transfers. An alternative to make those, those transfers were direct transfers to households. An alternative policy would be to have wage subsidies, in which transfers to primary, transfers would go also to primary and middle educated labor instead of targeting households directly. And we did look at that too, and I'll come back to that. Being interested in public finance and the financial system, we're concerned to model how these social transfers would be financed. So we looked at scenarios, 3 different scenarios. Would they be financed by government savings, reducing government expenditure on real categories? Would they be financed simply by raising taxes on the highest income deciles, raising the taxes on the rich? Would they be financed simply by reducing government expenditure in total? What results did we get? Well, we got some interesting results in our simulations. That is, we found that a full intervention which included extending the COVID-specific support package, if that was financed by lower government savings, lower government savings, that's simply expanding the budget, that is the least restrictive option. It would add 2% to GDP. That works because in our model, investment would not have been influenced endogenously. There wouldn't have been crowding out in our model. And that's an assumption within the model. If we had a different kind of intervention, which was financed by higher taxes, which was financed by higher taxes rather than by eating into government savings, GDP would increase, but at a lower level. The weaker GDP effect is caused simply by the lower disposable income of wealthier households as a result of the tax increase. Interventions financed by reallocation of current government spending would have a negative effect. If there were simply a wage subsidy instead of social transfers to households, or expanded social transfers to households, a wage subsidy would add just under 2% to GDP, but it would have a bad effect on income distribution. It would be less progressive than intervention in the form of simply social transfers directly to households, because of the pattern of employment of different social groups. So those were the outcomes we get, and those are the sort of outcomes that you would expect. They're common sense outcomes. But we feel that the measures we got for them were realistic. And that's supported by the fact that we trace the measures through each sector. We trace the direct and indirect effects through each sector. And here we're showing the impact upon gross value added in each sector. I won't go through that slide right now because that'll take us a very long time. The impact on income distribution, I've hinted at some of that, and this shows that the interventions that we made, here are the different scenarios: one financed by government savings, financed by taxes on the rich, etc. The interventions we make, if we are pro-poor, irrespective of the financing mechanism. But if we give it in the form of wage support, it is still progressive, but it's less progressive than if we give it in the form of social transfers. That's what we did. Those are the results. If anybody's interested, we can go through the kind of modeling exercise we do. I don't think we have time for that, but I'll simply say that the way we modeled this was different from was using a social accounting matrix to calculate the multipliers. We built a social accounting matrix calibrated to 2020, and so you can ask, what's the difference between this and standard multipliers, macroeconomic multipliers using national income aggregates? Well, the advantage of doing it this way is that the SAM social accounting matrix multipliers enable us to examine the diversity of policy effects across industrial sectors and to examine the effects on the distribution of income between deciles and employment in the different sectors. We're pleased with the work, and it's been well received. And I should say that this similar work has been done by one of our colleagues, Sherman Robinson. Similar work has been done calculating the impacts of COVID-19 on Mexico, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and gets similarly interesting results. I'll leave it at that, Ben.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Lawrence, and thank you for such an interesting presentation of something that's really, obviously very current and very important. Briefly, do we have any questions? Because I want to make sure that Hannes gets a good run at his paper. So any quick questions?
Ben, could I ask a quick question to Lawrence? Lawrence, I believe that the rollout of vaccines in South Africa is still proceeding extremely slowly. Only a tiny fraction of the population has been vaccinated. Now, I was wondering if you know what measures are being taken in South Africa to speed up the diffusion and take-up of vaccines, and whether your simulations might depend on the pace at which population will be vaccinated. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that important question, Pascal. You're right, the take-up, the rollout has been slow. It is now proceeding much faster, but there's a very low proportion of the population still that has been vaccinated. This type of modelling does not take account of the vaccine rollout, and it's a purely static model. The assumptions within it don't allow us to have really significant time changes in that, because being a social accounting matrix, we've got fixed coefficients, fixed prices, and so on. It's not a CGE model where we can look at the time path of things. But I should say that within the Reserve Bank of South Africa, enormous amount of effort is given to analysing the impact of the vaccine rollouts upon the path of GDP and employment and so on. The forecasting unit in the Reserve Bank of South Africa produces forecasts to the Monetary Policy Committee every 2 months. As you know, I mean, the forecasts go through several stages. At each stage of the forecasting process in 2 months, in those 2-month cycles, the progress of the vaccine rollout is built into the forecasting model. So I hope that's of some help to you. To my own mind, the way that the South African Reserve Bank does that is too mechanistic, and it applies that also to the world economy scene. To see what's happening to the world economy, they build in assumptions about the vaccine rollout in other countries of the world. But I feel they do it in a fairly mechanistic way. Perhaps that's the only way to do it.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Lawrence. Thank you. And thank you, Pasquale, for a good question. I'm going to now, our last talk is from Hannes Gegele. I hope I'm pronouncing that vaguely in the right direction, Hannes, who's going to talk about, expand on the kind of public health aspect of our theme today by talking about a polycentric approach to collective action in global public health. So Hannes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And of course, thanks also to everyone else who's been part of organizing the panel today. Let me just upload my presentation here. I think we are good to go. As Ben mentioned, I will take the next 10 to 15 minutes or so, quite a difficult act to follow, to talk about a polycentric approach to collective action in global public health. I'll talk a little bit about the methodology that I've been using, We already talked a little bit about the Middle East. We just talked about South Africa. I will talk about some of my findings from fieldwork in Thailand, and then I will come to some conclusions. So really, I think we all remember the first couple of months of the COVID response last year, and my paper very much focuses on the first 100 days after the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. And in those first days, the epicenter of the response really moved from, let's say, Wuhan in China, then to Bergamo in Italy, and on to New York. Christine and Damien earlier mentioned Hardin's tragedy of the commons, and that's something that sort of comes to mind when governing commons such as public health. But really what I would wanted to do with my paper was to look at a more bottom-up approach and use Ostrom's intellectual contributions to evolve such a bottom-up approach and look at the potential of polycentricity in governing public health. So Ostrom really defined polycentric governance as the interaction of many different actors who are interdependent from each other. They interact, they collaborate, but they also compete with each other at different levels within a common system of rules and towards joint collective outcome. Now, focusing on the pandemic, my paper analyzes the reasons for the global governance failure at first, and then asks how to strengthen collective action in global public health, and more so to what extent polycentric governance is actually conducive to improving the cost effectiveness of the COVID response. To analyze the reasons of the global failure, I've used Elinor Ostrom's institutional analysis and design framework. Originally, this framework has been very much used and applied in the context of local administration, in small-scale irrigation problems, forestry problems, and it's only starting from the 2000s really that Ostrom herself started applying the ID framework also to some of the global problems, including to climate change, which was also mentioned by some of the other speakers. So this really stimulated my sort of thinking around how to apply the ID framework to the pandemic. And those of you who are familiar with the ID framework, you will know that it's a suitable framework really to systematically analyze interdisciplinary policy problems with multiple action situations, and then to really look at the behavior of different stakeholders as they interact with each other. So among the many situations that I have analyzed for today's presentation, I just highlighted the rulemaking, the coordination, and the monitoring, sanctioning, and dispute resolution as the sort of key situations in the first 100 days. And the analysis of these situations really led me to four specific reasons why the global response really cost us over 280,000 lives in the first 100 days of the pandemic response. So first, it's the policymaking that was not sufficiently representative of both affected people, but also of the multiple stakeholders in global public health. The second reason is that national governments looked at economic cost and at health cost in different ways. The third reason is around stakeholder interaction that was marked by lack of trust in public health institutions, and in fact the inability to enforce any sense of solidarity among global parties, among the global community. And lastly, it's about existing coordination mechanisms that showed limited capacity to fully share information across national borders. So with these specific reasons in mind, really, I came to that key hypothesis of my paper, which is that polycentric governance is conducive to govern a cost-effective COVID-19 response. Now, how have I done this? I've used secondary data from Oxford's COVID-19 dataset, from the OECD and the IMF Economic Outlook. I've conducted 16 semi-structured interviews in Thailand. I included direct observations from my fieldwork. I've also done a literature review and found 61 articles that discuss the response in Thailand. So, looking at the analysis, the cost-effectiveness analysis, which here is really defined as comparing the number of fatalities to the projected economic loss by country, it's really striking to see significant variations. And it's interesting, I think, to observe that countries in Asia and the Pacific performed better overall. They were able to contain the number of deaths, of fatalities, and also limit the economic loss overall. As you can see on the slide in front of you, the fatality rate remained below 5 per million people in countries like Thailand, in China, Japan, Singapore, Australia, South Korea. And on the other side, in countries like the US, in Switzerland, the Netherlands, Sweden, I also mentioned Italy because this is where we all virtually sit today. The fatality rate was well above 190 per million people. And one can observe that the real GDP forecast followed actually a similar pattern. So economists predicted that South Korea, China, Singapore, they would limit the loss of GDP to -5%. Whereas other countries like the UK, France, and Italy, they would be worse off and decline by up to -11%. So among the 29 countries in my study, Thailand presented itself as a good and suitable case to analyze the actions that led to a successful performance for several reasons. It's a middle-income country in Asia. It's also characterized as a flawed democracy on the democracy index of the Economist Intelligence Unit. And Thailand was also, in fact, the first country outside of China to record and report any COVID cases. So just a very quick look at the timeline of key events in the early response. You can see that Thailand reacted very early on. In fact, the first date I highlighted here is on the 3rd of January, when Thailand sort of started to introduce thermal screening at the international airports. And it took about 3 weeks up to the 30th of January to really find the first case of local transmission. So it was sort of a slow entry into the pandemic up to March, when Thailand introduced the Center for COVID-19 Situation Administration for the overall coordination of the response. And then a couple of weeks later, declared, like many other countries as well, the national state of emergency. Now, what's interesting in Thailand in terms of the numbers of cases was that after this spike of COVID cases that was observed in March, and after the declaration of the national state of emergency, within 1 month, the cases dropped from 107 on the 25th of March to no cases after reported in the period between 25th of May and then until November. So I was really interested in asking, why is this so, and what has contributed to this situation from a governance perspective? And putting on a polycentric lens now really requires to observe the interaction of the multiple stakeholders, the sort of making and also the breaking of rules, and also the access to information. While it's impossible, I think, to detail the emerging complexity of all the stakeholders, the multiple actors that are present in the Thai pandemic response. But what's interesting is that over the past 40 years, Thailand made significant investments to strengthen its public health infrastructure. And most importantly, really, the study has shown that Thailand built the capacity of over 1 million health volunteers to track, to trace, and also to monitor infections in local communities. But then their efforts alone could not have been sufficient to build up the extent of collective action really that is required to tackle a global pandemic. So the Thai government was quick at launching a whole of government and also a whole of society response by creating this coordinating center that I just mentioned before, and also by the fact that the Thai Ministry of Public Health actively engaged in both regional and also in international collaboration, information exchange, and capacity building with the WHO and also with ASEAN, its regional body. So the COVID-19 response really saw significant engagement from different actors, also from the private sector. Early on, technical firms developed medical technology. One example, Siam Biosciences developed locally produced COVID-19 diagnostic kits. I'm sure you all know Thailand is a very touristy country, so also the tourism industry was very quick at adapting and transforming or repurposing hotels into alternative quarantine hotels, or a new concept that sort of flared up into hospitals. So a combination of hospital and a hotel. Now, in many countries, the WHO actually failed to enforce compliance with international rules. In fact, over the past 15 years, only 59 of the 196 governments who signed the legally binding international health regulation, they also introduced national action plans. And not a single country actually fully funded this action plan. Now, Thailand's engagement with the WHO has been different in terms of collaboration. One example would be the fact that the Thai government was very quick at establishing the response protocols in line with the global procedures. The Thai focal point for this international health regulation, the Thai IHR focal point, was able to report back to the WHO within only 30 minutes from the moment the first COVID case was reported. So if you recall what happened in China and in other countries, this paints quite a different picture in terms of global collaboration. And a second interesting example that I wanted to share with you today is around the guidance on the rational use of personal protective equipment such as face masks. Now, Thailand recommended the use of face masks very early on in the pandemic, and as early as in February, one could observe people wearing masks. In fact, it had become kind of a social imperative to wear masks to protect oneself, but also to protect the community as a whole. And And by July, the Thai private sector had scaled up the mask supply from 1.2 to 4.2 million pieces per day in 23 factories, 12 more than at the beginning of the pandemic. And also another significant contributor was that the government made masks price-controlled item early on. So for the rulemaking outside Thailand and upstream, I think it's quite impressive. At the same time, in my study, I also found that for the rulemaking within Thailand, this coordinating center played a leading role. The center was actually and keeps being chaired by the Thai Prime Minister, and it's interesting because it's really the political leadership that stepped aside in Thailand to allow public health professionals to lead the response in this COVID center under the overall leadership of the Prime Minister, of course. It's been interesting to conduct the interviews in Thailand because some have really argued that the center is overusing its mandate, especially when it came to extending the emergency decree beyond the first 3 months. But other respondents really have pointed out that these local health volunteers and the fact that they were able to collect data at local level, they were able to influence the decision making of public health officials in this coordinating center. So a very much bottom-up driven approach. The study also acknowledged that in the early days of the pandemic, there was quite a bit of confusion, like in many other countries. Respondents mainly mentioned that this confusion stemmed from the different sort of messaging from local community leaders, but also politicians, also from health officials themselves. So again, with the creation of this COVID center, we've seen a kind of turning point in terms of access to information, because the Thai government from March onwards invested heavily in public education in multiple languages. And the WHO in Thailand also played an instrumental role in supporting the government's information management and also the translation of technical guidance. So really to engage with communities, the stakeholders in Thailand have become very creative in terms of using social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Line, YouTube, TikTok, you name it. And it's also been really interesting to observe that these local health volunteers that I have now mentioned a couple of times played a significant role in reaching the most vulnerable communities, the poorest of the poor, and also some of the migrant workers in Thailand. So concluding, really, I found that Thailand's success of containing the pandemic in the first 100 days very much builds on a polycentric governance approach, parting from this assumption that countries with authoritarian regimes in Asia perform better because of their ability to command and to control individual behavior. My case study actually observed that a flawed democracy and a polycentric approach to governing COVID-19 are mutually non-exclusive. In fact, many stakeholders led by these frontline health volunteers, they stepped in at multiple levels to make up for the global failure of containing the pandemic. And this polycentric approach, however, I also have to say, requires a significant extent of coordination to enhance collective action. Now, in her 2009 Nobel address, Ostrom concluded that, and I quote here, that a core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in humans. Now, turning to my study and to the global COVID response, I found it very tempting to reframe Ostrom's comment and to reposition the WHO as such a focal stakeholder who could be able and bring out the best in national governments and in public stakeholders. Now, the voices are already becoming louder and louder around reforming the WHO. And in my study, also in the paper, I look at what this would mean for the WHO. And so going forward, this would require a more polycentric global governance and coordination structure that takes into account not only the current WHO shareholders, but actually all global public health stakeholders. And very importantly, it would also require the review of assessed membership fees and to strengthen the WHO's financial independence from its shareholders. So with that, Ben, I would very much like to hand it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Hannes, and thanks for such an interesting talk. We're up on time now, so I gather there's a 15-minute break before the next set of sessions. So if anyone has any questions, the room will stay open for a minute. But if not, and you need a break, then do go and break, and that'll give you a moment before the next session starts in about 10 minutes. So any questions for Hannes now? If not, we'll thank him and thank all colleagues. Oh, sorry, Christine. Yes, your hand's up.
Just a very quick question for Hannes, because Hannes is also, well, he's not speaking on behalf of the UN here, but he's also working in the UN. I mean, I think this point of reimagining international institutions is so important because time, for both climate change and for vaccines, time is of the essence, and we need to do this very quickly. But I just wondered if you had a feel for whether that is possible. Can we meet that challenge in the next few months?
Thanks, Christine, for the question. I like to be ambitious, and I like to think positively. So I would think that it is possible, but as I also mentioned in my paper, this requires the willingness of member states to reimagine institutions, and I think it requires a longer timeline than a couple of months. In terms of the broader UN community, international organizations, it makes me think of the SDGs and the 2030 agenda and the effort of bringing in a more collective and inclusive approach to implementing the SDGs, which also refers to climate change and public health and many other global problems. So I would like to remain ambitious and hope that governments increasingly move towards that direction.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Hannes, and thanks to all colleagues for their excellent presentations. Thank you to our colleagues at University of Rome Tor Vergata for helping Pasquale and everyone put together such an interesting session. I think we've all looked at some interesting issues from a variety of different angles and very much in line with SOAS's philosophy, looked at them from the perspective of our regions. So with that, we'll call this part of the session to a halt. We'll thank both our speakers and our participants, and enjoy the rest of the conference. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Io non sento niente.
Sì, professore, siamo in pausa, pochi minuti e poi possiamo iniziare.
Grazie Federica, grazie tante.
Ciao Pompeo, riusciamo a sentirci?
Ciao, ho sentito lo speriamo.
Stavo vedendo se riuscivo a caricarlo. Non ho mai capito se deve essere aperto o giusto o semplicemente nella barra degli strumenti.
Vabbè,
Vedremo.
non lo so, io so che è 1 anno e mezzo che lo uso e ancora non ho capito veramente come funziona.
Intanto buongiorno a tutti, anche Donato Masciandaro
buongiorno Marcello.
è già
Ciao,
connesso,
Marcello.
quindi siamo tutti al completo. Aspettiamo appunto qualche minuto e poi
Ma
procediamo.
abbiamo capito se tutti, anche l'altra sessione confluisce qui da noi? Non si è capito. No, questa è specifica per la nostra.
Quale altra sessione?
Non ci sono 2 sessioni
Noi
parallele.
finiamo all'1:15, speriamo.
Ma
Poi
non c'è
una
un'altra
pausa
sessione?
e poi proseguono altre sessioni.
Ah, non c'è una sessione parallela alla nostra?
Sì, c'è una parallela ma in un altro canale.
Ah, ecco, quindi qui
Confermo.
Bene,
Grazie Federica, preziosissima.
Va bene, allora approfitto. Vado a prendere un bicchiere d'acqua.
Intanto saluto Nicola, saluto Donato, di cui sarò discussant, Enrico, Donatella, oltre che Marcello naturalmente che ho già salutato. Ciao ciao.
Ciao. Grazie, saluti a tutti.
Ciao a tutti.
Donato, buongiorno. Ciao Donatella.
Ciao.
Ora, se mi riuscisse a levare questo fondo che ce l'ho da un po' e non so più
Posso
come si fa a levarlo.
Luigi Paganetto speaking.
Professor Paganetto, buongiorno.
Buongiorno, buongiorno.
Conference. Thanks a lot for the papers, for the contribution, to be here discussing in the session the problem of the COVID-19 and economic policy for a sustainable recovery. Okay, and the chairman is Marcello Signorelli, Perugia University, and the Economy Society, the Society of the Economists, Italian Economists. So, thank you, Marcello, thank you, Nicola, thank you to everybody for the participation and for the, the contribution that we are presenting to us. Okay, Marcello, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Luigi, for your work, for organizing this 32nd edition of the Villa Mondragone International Economic Seminar, and especially for continuing to collaborate with the Italian Economic Association that since some years we started this fruitful collaboration. But I think we can start immediately because we have 4 very interesting and very rich papers and discussions, so we don't have a lot of time. So we will start with Nicola Cocella that really started this collaboration. So I want to thank again for continuing also as speakers today. And he will talk about pandemic and the future of European Monetary Union. I know that Nicola has some slides he can try to share. Please, Nicola.
Nicola, devi aprire il microfono.
You have.
Devi aprire il
We cannot
microfono.
hear you. Nicola, you have to open the microphone, but at the moment is not working. You have to check in your computer because something is not right to permit to the microphone to work correctly. So I suggest to move, to wait for one more second, but if
Marcello, I'm ready.
Yes.
You know, if you need a London or Rust resort, you know, monetary policy is my stuff. So
okay,
I'm ready.
I fully agree. So Donato Masciandaro is presenting something very unusual. So the lesson of Venice 1630 for today's central banking and the pandemic recession. So please, Donato, and when Nicola will solve the problem, we'll do his presentation. Please, Donato.
Thanks, Marcello.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask just only a moment to say hello to Donato Masciandaro? A lot of time having the possibility to be in touch with him, but I have the opportunity to read any time the article on Sole 24 Ore on the other newspaper. So my best welcome, Donato. My best welcome to everybody, obviously. To Enrico Marelli, to Donatella Saccone, to Anna Maria Simonazzi, Pompeo della Posta, and especially at Nicola Accocella, that has been so kind to give me a mail from San Luigi. Thank you. Go ahead.
Luigi, I'm so glad because as usual, you show that you are always the first mover because you anticipate my thanks to you and the pleasure to see you again after a long time. So as usual, you are a sort of never-ending story. You are always the first mover. So thanks for your invitation and glad to be here. Now I'm wondering with Marcello, what about my slides? What do I have to do? I have to share.
Yes.
I have to share with you and with the participants the screen. Sorry, let me just open the slides that I need. These are the slides. Now I can share screen. Okay, this is a. Do you see my slides?
It's okay.
Okay, let me in order for the sake in order to save time. Let me just recall the motivation. This recession has been defined an unconventional one, for example, by Christine Lagarde. Why an unconventional? Because usually a conventional recession starts in one of the traditional three parts of our macroeconomic system and then triggering to a contagion effect the other sectors. In this case, we have an exceptional, unconventional, I would say, recession, because we have an outside trigger, which has been the mix between the pandemic per se and the consequences and the related health policies made by the policymakers all around the world. And so we can wonder, is this recession unique? Is a sort of an outlier? My answer is no, because we can find out in history some interesting tales, for example, from the Serenissima experiences. And I'm just trying to summarize today a tale, and there is a background paper made by Charles Goodard, Stefano Ugolini, and myself. And this paper basically is an historical monetary policy paper, in a sense that we apply a modern monetary policy model in trying to interpret a past history. And because we are convinced that this kind of exercise is a two-way story, in the sense that we can learn more from, we can understand better the past and the present as well. And the historical case is exactly a pandemic recession with occurring in Venice during the year 1629 and 1639, when the Republic, the Serenissima, fought first a famine and then a plague pandemic. Which is the bottom line of the paper, is that the monetary policy that the Republic implemented during these years can be considered an historical case of helicopter money. Let me give some, really, notwithstanding the time constraints, some background information on Venice. Venice implemented its first legislation to address a plague in 1423, and a health office was established in 1490. So they were able to react when a pandemic occurred. So they developed a regulation on plague with essentially three aims: to prevent its originating in Venice, to impede its importation, and to check its spread should it break out in the sea. And during the plague episodes, the Serenissima imposed a general blockade on all neighbors suspected of plague. On top, the containment measure were carried into effect on a colossal scale with full resource of the state. And in this occasion, the trade-off that today we know very well between health and economics eventually emerge, and with it, the political and economic cost and benefit analysis. Let me say that, for me, it was really exciting to study these past experiences, because I found out really anecdotal, quite similar to the today story. For example, let me quote an episode in 1579 when the Senate reacted in a very slow way, both for political reasons, both denying the plague and downsizing the number and nature of this. And if you wonder why, the answer is that politics matter. Let me quote a textile merchant that complained for the quarantine, given that an incomparable greater number of people has died purely as a result of unemployment than of tables of any other contagious diseases. In this kind of a session, also the population was watchful of the activities of the politicians, and they were ready to riot and tumult if they became convinced that the government was not doing all it could and should have done to ensure the availability of food, guaranteeing the so-called right of bread. So, how the Senates of the Serenissima usually address and fix this trade-off between health and economics? The answer was eventually fiscal bazooka. Let me use modern terminology, which is the idea. The idea is that usually during the pandemics, the Senates bought necessary goods from merchants, and city districts were put in quarantine. The inhabitants were provided by the states. Poor laws were promoted to reduce the risk of disease. Moreover, Venetian politician influences employment and nominal wages in sectors under his total or partial control, as the arsenal. Finally, last but not least, during the pandemic, program public work were likely to be defined and implemented in order to give unemployment people a livelihood was considered. At the end of the story, in all of these episodes, we have a crucial chain with 4 rings. The first rings are pandemic costs for the inhabitants. The second ring are the reaction of the government, i.e. fiscal transfer with its financing problems. And finally, there is a dimension in terms of political consensus. Let me just give you 4 pictures of these 4 essential rings of our chain. First ring, pandemic cost. In the past and in the present, when a pandemic occurs, economic activity can be hit in different ways. How to capture these differences, how to capture the fact that citizens can be hit in an heterogeneous way. A simple way is to distinguish between risky activity and safe activity, where the risky activity are the activities that are hit by the pandemic, means by the pandemic per se and by the containment policies. Why safe activity are safe respect to this risk. So in a way, using the usual micro foundation of a micro model, we can define the budget constraints of a citizens as the sum up of these 2 possible sources of revenue. Given this pandemic cost, the government, I will say, is forced to intervene, to inject resources in the economy, and which could be a general metric for this fiscal action, could be a proportion of the citizen loss. Moreover, the government have to finance this fiscal bazooka, and the 3 levers are the usual one: taxes, debts, and monetization, which is the objective function of the government. Let me start from the usual assumption that the government is a benevolent policymaker, i.e. is a social planner. So, which could be the key part of her or his objective function. Essentially 3: the direct channels, consumption effect. On top, we can have 2 kinds of externality. Monetary instability costs, the more we do fiscal monetization on one side. On the other side, more pandemic policy gains, i.e. the gains to implement a public policy action, i.e. without this policy, we will have higher costs, second round effect. In the overall designs of this policy, there is also monetization, and the social planner can design an optimal monetization. It is easy to show that this optimal fiscal monetization will depend on how the taxes are distortive, how the cost of debts is high, and how higher are the monetary externality sensibility among the citizens. Final step: are we sure that the government is a social planner? The answer is no. So what about if we assume that first, in charge we have not a benevolent dictators, but a politician, and 2, the citizens are hit in an heterogeneous way by the fiscal transfer action and by its finances as well. At the end of the story, the more are true these 2 assumptions, the more it's possible that each citizens have preferences respect to the overall economic policy and regarding the the monetization, which can be different from the social optimal one. And it is possible to define in general, it's a multiple equilibria setting. In other way, here, in a nutshell, which is the bottom line. The bottom line is that technically we can define any kind of monetization. There is no problem to define technically a fiscal monetization. The real problem for the implementation is the political consensus around this monetization. Okay, if this is the theoretical framework, which was the historical episode. There was a bubonic plague that hit Venice from September 1630 to September 1631. And on top, we have to remember that in early modern times, we have usually the three horses of apocalypse. In general, we have war, famine, and epidemics that were deeply intertwined. In fact, in 1629, the republics, as already called with the famine, where extreme hunger has been the one hand correlated with war and the other hand with the plague. There was a massive heartbreak in Venice that was really huge in absolute terms, as also comparing it with modern Fiji. There was a series of consequences of the inhabitants, a series of consequences, both from a demographic point of view and from an economic point of view. We have no time to speculate on this, but in order to address this pandemics, as you know, the Senate decided immediately to have the population with a fiscal bazooka. How to finance it? Here I have just to record that Venice in early modern time reached a degree of monetization completely unknown for century anywhere else. In fact, in order to economize on coins, inhabitants, citizens commonly use check and bank transfers, even for the lower middle class. Republic of the Mice issues both commodity money, coins, and convertible monies as well, through the establishment of two subsequent and overlapping public banks, the Rialto Bank and the Giro Bank. The setting, the overall setting using modern terminology, was a fiscal dominance regime in the sense that the Senate, economically, the Senate controlled completely both the fiscal lever and the monetary level. So what the Senate did, on the one side, he established a lump sum wealth tax. On the other side, he implemented a monetary helicopter money. In other way, what was the decision in terms of monetary policy? In normal time, we have the Giro banks that issues roughly 800,000 of ducats. Then during the pandemic, the Giro balance sheet reached a peak of over more than 2.6 million ducats in June 60/30. In other way, we entered definitely in extraordinary time. Which was the consequences? The consequences was a huge depreciation of the money and the collapse of the Giro Bank. But the government, at the end of the story, was able to come back to new normal at the end of the story. Later on, but it was able to come back. Why the story can be just defined, not just an exceptional monetary policy action, but specifically an helicopter money. Here we have the definition of helicopter money proposed by Galli in 2020. And this modern definition is the last one of a long history of definition. And let me just note in here, for if there is any clique, which is Lavasmy, History of Economic Thought, it seems to me that the Friedman's 1969 image of helicopter money sound quite similar to the image that Hume used in 1752. But let me close this history of economic thought consideration, and which is in a nutshell this definition. We have helicopter money when two assumptions occur. On one side, we have an extraordinary monetary policy expansionary action. But in parallel, we have, in modern time, intended losses in the central bank balance sheets. In Venice, we have these two assumptions that holds with the specification that the losses, we have no documents, but we cannot say if the losses were intended or unintended. But the Senate Venice decision were absolutely consistent with the modern definition of helicopter money. Here we have just a picture to give you a visual sense of what happened in terms of Euclid evaluation during the plague. Just to be compliant with the time constraints, which are the takeaway of this story. Let me specify that this is normal. This is a positive analysis. It's not a normative analysis. So, from a positive point of view, I think that we can have at least three different takeaways. First, the relationships between history and economics is really a two-way road. On the one side, as I said at the beginning of my reflection, historical events are useful for evaluating current macroeconomic situation. On top, modern economic theory can provide a logical framework to analyze historical facts. Secondly, the event that today we code are exceptional, true, are likely to be unconventional, but are not completely unknown. In fact, first, we already noted this link between pandemic recession and heterogeneous consequences on citizens, i.e. inequality matter. Secondly, we already found out the trade-off between policies on one side and economic reasons and consideration on the others. Third, in terms of economic policies, we found out in historical past this mix between the need of fiscal containment policies and the need to finance is through money creation. Last but not least, I think that the big takeaways in this tale is that there is a never-ending story. The never-ending story is that any monetary policy action can be completely analyzed if you use at least two methodological tools: economics on one side and political economy on the other side. Another way, and to be focused on helicopter money, if you're thinking about that, Friedman proposed these metaphors in 1969, and so far I never see a monetary an helicopter money that fly. Which could be the interpretation? My interpretation is that from a technical point of view, there could be no problem to have an helicopter money. but the helicopter money is less likely to occur, is difficult to be implemented for political economy reasons, because the more you have monetary policy that trigger heterogeneous distributional effect on the citizen, the more difficult it will be to reach a consensus. Let me stop here with this.
Thank you, Donato. Thank you very much. Now the discussant in very few minutes, Pompeo della Posta, University of Pisa.
Thank you very much. I'm struggling with my video. It might go away, but anyway, I'm going to share the screen because I have a few slides to accompany my discussion. So first of all, thank you, Donato, for the nice presentation. I think you should be seeing my screen now.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So this is just the introductory part. Well, I'm afraid I relied very much on the CPR discussion paper that was circulated at the beginning. So I read that one and I took that as a reference. There are many similarities, of course, with the presentation that Donato gave us today, but also some differences. So you know, in the discussion paper, in the original paper that he was circulating, he distinguished between net worth helicopter money and monetary base helicopter money, right? And these are two different concepts that I think can be seen more clearly by looking at the this little simple approach, right? Which is the accounting approach of the central bank. So if we start, central bank has gold, assets, and liabilities, right? And just for the accounting rules, gold, the asset side has to correspond to the liability side, right? So you have this net capital. This is very important. We'll come back. The fact that here to what we have in the asset, what happens here is the net capital, okay? So what happens when you create monetary base? And he also discusses the issue of seigniorage, because the two different definitions of helicopter money imply also have different implications for seigniorage. So in the case in which there is no seigniorage, gold is simply transformed into monetary base. This is a gold standard, typical gold standard, with no seigniorage. Why? Because gold applies directly to monetary base. But you can also have seigniorage. What does it mean, seigniorage? It means that you have gold, but then you have a nominal, nominal value on the coins that you print, and the nominal money is higher than the actual content in gold, right? And so this means that you get a little difference, which is the amount of seigniorage. You can think of this as the credit that goes to the treasury. Right. So once we move to the definitions that Donato gives us and his co-authors give us about helicopter money. This is the first definition: net worth helicopters money. The definition that implies, and this is the a conclusion that recurs in the literature quite often, is that whenever you produce this supply of money, you lose capital. Why? Because you see that the net capital used to be 10, and now it becomes 8 in this little example, right? Why? Because you create these 2 units of money that goes to finance, citizens. This is also the crucial point. In this definition of helicopter money, here you really do not have government expenditure, right? So you don't have anything here on the asset side, right? You just throw money to the citizens with nothing in exchange for the central bank. So there is nothing here on the asset side. And this is why you have this loss here. However, it should be clear that this is a virtual loss. It's not a proper loss, right? So you have thrown money, you have created money, you have in theoretical terms lost some capital, although my claim is that it's not a proper loss. This instead is the other definition of helicopter money. the monetary, what he defines, and his co-authors define monetary-based helicopter money. Here there is a government intervening, right? So if we go back to Friedman, of course, in the Friedman case, he doesn't believe in the government, so he prefers to throw money directly to the citizens. Whereas in the other case, money is thrown to the government that then makes the fiscal expenditure for the citizens, right? But in this case, as you can see, there is something here on the asset side, government assets. So there is a creation of money, but there is a counterparty here on the asset side. So there is no loss of capital, right? So this is a little clarification. And this is very important for the conclusions that and the main I would say critical point that I'm going to raise to the again to the working paper rather than to today's presentation. Another point which and so we'll get back to that in a minute. Another point which is raised in the working paper that I read is relative to the role of inequality. They claim that inequality matters, and in particular, they say consolidating the balance sheets of the Mint and of the Giro Bank. The Mint is what the government can do to print money. So there is a strange definition of government, which of course corresponds to the historical case. Government could print money, could coin, could print coins. And the Giro Bank, which is sort of commercial bank that was issuing inside money, right? So consolidated balance sheets of Mint and Giro Bank and having heterogeneous citizens, therefore inequality matters, we showed that the Republic actually implemented helicopter money driven by political economy reasons in order to avoid popular riots. So basically they claim that this issuing of helicopter money, whatever the form it was in the Venice Republic, was due to this problem of inequality. Now, if we look at the literature on inequality, we see that there is quite some skepticism on the effects of inequality on riots, revolutions, etc., right? So, in fact, here what I would claim is that rather than issue of inequality here, what matters is really the extreme poverty, the fact that these people were just starving. And so this is why you have riots, not because you have inequality, they feel that they have less than the others, but they are surviving. They're just not surviving. So maybe pointing to the role of inequality might be, I don't know, barking at the wrong tree, I don't know. But, I go to the final point. Marcello, I see you're getting nervous. The main objection. What is the main objection? Well, because you say, because the Giro Bank was a state bank with no paid-up capital, the operation actually amounted to a bailout of the central bank by the government, right? So here, first of all, you have this sort of apparently fancy point that the government bails out the central bank rather than the other way around. We usually think about the central bank bailing out the governments and not the way around. So they argue that what the Venetian Republic did implied losses for the money issuer. So the government intervened. They had to, to activate the Mint to print coins to repay the excess of inside money printed by the Giro Bank. And this, in their interpretation, implied the fact that they incurred a loss because this money printed by the government will have to be repaid by taxes. So this is why the losses. And they say, this is exactly the same loss that we experience with the modern form of helicopter money, right? But my claim is that this parallel is not really appropriate because in the net worth helicopter money, the losses of the central bank are only nominal, as we have discussed before, only nominal and virtual. They are an accounting element. What the authors want to suggest instead is they're proper true loss, implying the imposition of future taxes. But this is precisely what the helicopter money is for. If we ask the central bank, the European Central Bank, to pay for the expenses to respond to the pandemic, it's precisely because we don't want to have the burden of the debt to repay in 3, 4, 5 years' time, right? A burden that might actually kill, might risk to kill our recovery. Thank you. I see that Marcello is really.
Thanks, Pompeo. Donato, you have to select 1 point raised by Pompeo, so 1 minute for a reply.
Marcello, I'm glad, because what one finger means 1 second, no, one minute. Pompeo, thanks a lot for your discussion. I'm sure that with more time we can agree, because having a working paper and a short presentation, I'm sure that, you know, the sender is obscured, and so the delivery can be better. But in a nutshell, we are convinced that if we consider that in extraordinary time, for example, in Venice, was the government that bailed out the central bank, which was not a commercial bank. Absolutely no. What the state issued public bonds with no commercial business. So definitely it was a central bank. I cannot say central bank because there is a debate between Charles Goodell on one side and others, because Charles said in Venice there were no private banks, so we cannot say a central bank. So let me stop here on this terminology discussion. But Pompeo, I remain to be convinced that you know, in extraordinary time, if there is bailout, there is a big differences between an helicopter mine just with monetary base and helicopter mining with capital losses. It's imply a different flow, different destination of the future flow of seniors. But let me stop here. I became boring, and thank you, Pompeo, for your discussion.
Thank you. We try again with the Nicola.
Thank you, Donato.
Nicola Cocella, if now the computer is working. You can try to unmute your microphone. No, it's still not working. So
now it works. But Nicola, try.
It's low, but it's working.
I cannot hear.
Sorry.
You have to check again the computer to increase the volume of the microphone. So we move to the other presentation. So Anna Simonazzi, Sapienza University of Rome and National Council of Economics and Labor. She will talk about the German's 2 models and the long-term sustainability of Eurozone. Please, Anna.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, fine. I will try to be, let me try to see, yes. I will try to be brief. Let me start with the motivation. The EU faces a future, the title is, of course, Germany's 2 models and the long-term sustainability of the Eurozone. The motivation is that the EU faces a future of high public and private debts at a time when the world economy is undergoing a structural change of proportions comparable to that experienced in the 70s. These challenges pose a serious threat to the entire European Union and in particular to its weaker members, calling for a new, more cohesive industrial policy, including a massive investment program that is at odds with premature fiscal tightening and a return to the old rules. In my presentation, I investigate the economic and political conditions for this change to come about, arguing that it would require nothing short of a U-turn in economic theory and policies, the macroeconomic and the industrial level. I pay particular attention to Germany as it is decisive in defining the European response to these multiple challenges. I skip the outline and let me start with the question that also Nicola Acocella will tackle in his presentation, that is the COVID-19 a game changer? I can go pretty quickly on comparing the two crises, the 2008 crisis and the current one. In the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, it was believed that with the evidence of the costs caused by neoliberalism and financialization, Keynesian thinking would finally be reasserted. But after a brief Keynesian spell, austerity came instead, ushered in by the bailout of the financial system and the doom loop between banks and the states. Recurring crises within the Eurozone and the changing international conditions expose the vulnerability of the Eurozone economic model and the inadequacy of its institutional structure. So even before the current pandemic, there was a growing awareness of the gravity of these challenges, and that urged a rethinking of policies and institutions. But proposals of reforms met with creditor countries' outright opposition or only partial implementation. The banking union is the most eclatant example. However, compared to the post-2008 crisis, the response to the pandemic has been much faster. The European Central Bank intervention has been swift, large, and, most important, targeted to more fragile countries. On the fiscal front, we have the Stability Pact that was suspended and state aid regulations temporarily relaxed. National governments undertook huge increases in public debt to subsidize firms, workers, and households. Then came the Next Generation EU, which was ushered in by the Franco-German agreement and hailed as an Hamiltonian moment. Despite surging fiscal deficit, even high debt countries enjoyed extremely low interest rates. So the first question is this a Keynesian moment? That is, does this remarkable monetary and fiscal activism mean a rehabilitation of Keynesian theory? Well, there are several hints that we can see. Let's say the supremacy still attributed to savings as a permissive condition for investment. The claim that complementarities between monetary and fiscal policies should be fully exploited in tail events, but may be irrelevant or even counterproductive in normal times and cannot be made to be permanent. The frequent reference to the need to return as soon as possible to rules of sound finance. The undisputed priority given to the problem of public debt, to such an extent to suggest allocating part of the Next Generation EU to debt reduction. And finally, the influential minority in the European Central Bank's Governing Council, recently joined by Weidmann, favoring an earlier end to monetary easing. All these examples provide ample evidence suggesting that we are still within the textbook Keynesian case of depression. Once we are out of the tail event, the old rules apply again. So the post-pandemic path will be mainly defined in terms of, or is mainly defined in terms of how to pay off the debt. And we have different opposite positions. There is the German and the Northern countries position, which says that the stability and growth path should stay. We need fiscal consolidation. That means rein in the deficit and reduce the public debt, which has been inherited by the pandemic. Not only Schäuble, but even recently Scholz said that the stability and growth path should stay. And then there is the other position held mainly by the French academics, which says revisions and reinterpretations of rules, which means get rid of numbers. There is no analytical basis for these numbers, and go for country-specific medium-term objectives. Well, one should know that this would not lighten the debt burden of the most indebted countries and puts too much of a task on income growth in reducing the debt to GDP ratio. There is a growing consensus that argues that criteria are too far from the post-COVID realities. A return to the rules of the pre-crisis era would be fatal for the survival of the euro. So there are several proposals for mutualization, monetization. The discussion is open, but the creditor countries are not very convinced. I would like to argue that even a change of fiscal rules without a change of the whole model is unlikely to bring about the much needed convergence between core and periphery. What is needed is addressing the long-term structural problems that led to the increasing divergences among its members along all the period of Europeanization, the process to increase the convergence. The structural causes of divergence can be explained in terms of the divergent trajectories of interdependent economies with different productive capabilities. There is no time to enter in this analysis. We have wrote a book on this together with Celi, Guarascio, and Gainsbourg. But this is a most important point because it depends on whether we are responding to these causes, whether in the future we'll have convergence or divergence. And the idea is that the southern peripheral countries were exposed to macroeconomic and industrial policy measures that, although apparently neutral, generated different effects and increasing regional disparities between core and periphery and within countries. This is a very important point because we talk about symmetric and asymmetric shocks, but symmetric shocks, as the recent pandemic shows, can have very asymmetric consequences. That is, the same policy has not the same effects on countries that are on different levels of development. And this is what this slide would like to show. We had two shocks in the 2000, China access to the World Trade Organization and eastward enlargement. And these two shocks, let's call them, had very different effects. China access meant a new market for Germany, but a new competitor for the Southern European countries. Eastward enlargement, similarly, meant the redirection of German foreign direct investment and trade to the Eastern countries, somehow displacing the Southern economies. So we end up with two peripheries, the South and the Eastern periphery, suffering from different fragilities which descend from their common, albeit diverse, economic and financial dependence on the core. But the core itself is dependent on the pattern of specialization within the European Union. The South provides an outlet for its surplus of manufacturers. The Eastern countries supply cheap inputs for its industries. So this combination of structural divergence and economic interdependence lies behind the fragility of the Union, but also on the improbability of its disintegration, given the high costs that it would entail for core and peripheries alike. It is always said that it will never be the same again. In fact, as in the 70s, the EU is confronting with new epochal changes in the world of production, the digital transformation, new consumption patterns, reversal from globalization to regional blocks, as well as growing inequalities and disenchantment with the European project. COVID-19 has speeded up the path of these changes. Germany and the entire Europe are falling behind in the tech race and must compete in a global market with nations that are actively supporting their industry in the innovation race. This calls for a common coordinated response for a radical change in the institutional and productive structures of the Eurozone. And so we need a new industrial strategy for Europe. And this has been finally launched by the European Commission to cope with the twin transition to green and digital. But these changes risk to worsen the gap between core and periphery. New technologies are based on system integration that operate at both the technological and the organizational levels. Their opportunities are maximized when they interact with a closely connected technological advanced network, which is often missing in latecomer countries. Moreover, big tech companies have created a closed oligopolistic market. The omnipresence of digital technologies in industry and services offer these companies enormous power of penetration, control over the rest of the economy. So the traditional industrial policy based on granting subsidies, tax breaks, or credit facilities, which are the core of the current recovery fund of Italy, is no longer up to the task. The EU needs to balance two potentially conflicting objectives. On the one hand, foster EU scientific excellence and technological capabilities, and on the other, favoring convergence across its regions. The first objective requires to fill the EU's innovation gap, that is, to fill the EU's innovation gap will require an enormous effort in investment by member states and the EU. But convergence, preventing the digital transformation from becoming an additional factor of polarization, would call for massive investment in the weakest areas, aiming at strengthening infrastructure facilities, industrial capabilities, and technological transfer. And also, which is important, participation of firms from less developed regions to the European-wide programs, such as industrial alliances in batteries, semiconductors, and all that. So we need a new, more cohesive industrial policy. And this can only succeed if we have a U-turn in macroeconomic philosophy, including fiscal rules. If we need investment, we need to try a different solution to the fiscal constraints. Here, Germany's stance is decisive. In the European response to these multiple challenges. And here we come to Germany. Not even Germany can go alone in this international context, but it can go on either together with the other member countries, giving a helping hand in the development of the whole European area, which means also the macroeconomic constraints, or as the leader of an economic empire. Past experience has demonstrated the short-sightedness of the latter option. So the outcome of these two conflicting positions is uncertain. The German model is not monolithic, but rather a complex and changing process of antagonism and accommodation between different domestic advocacy coalitions that sway German choices in European and foreign policy. And it exhibits over time subtle shifts in its center of gravity, depending on the particular situation and on which coalition is ascendant on particular issues. This makes the next election so important. However, fiscal hawks have to contend with the risks of implosion their policies could bring. And then remember the industrial interconnection between the East and the South. This is a problem if the European Eurozone blows up. So this is my last point. It asks the question whether this time will be different. So the historically low German and European private and public expenditure has been a drag rather than a cause of greater prosperity. Savings without investment are not a brilliant idea. And this has failed to drive in the direction of the urgently required modernization of physical, digital, and social infrastructure. Catching up with foreign incumbents and governing the technological transformation require an enormous effort in research and investment. This, in turn, requires replacing the doctrine of austerity with a growth-friendly model. And member countries must join forces to acquire minimal mass to compete with big tech incumbents. In the past, the prospect of the system imploding succeeded in mobilizing counteractive forces strong enough to stall disintegration. The Next Generation EU plan can present the first step in the direction of more cohesive management of the EU. It requires swift and non-acrimonious consensus over the funds by the creditor countries and efficient use by the receiving countries. Whether it will be different this time, we'll see. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Very rich presentation and also very rich paper. I am the discussant, so for me the work is very simple because I have not strong critics on the details that you mentioned in your presentation and more deeply in your paper, but I have three comments. The first two refer not to economics, but more to politics and political economy, but more politics. The first one is, I agree, obviously, that Germany is crucial for the future of European Union, especially the European Monetary Union. But Germany, as we know all, is related to Merkel for several years. And you mentioned the next election. But what do you think about the possible role of Mario Draghi, the current Italian Prime Minister, eventually our future President of the Italian Republic, on this scenario from the political point of view, not like economist? I was asking you about Mario Draghi as politician, because in my view he's a politician on several aspects. So do you think it will be important not only for Italian but also for Germany to move to the right model, to the better model? And this is the first point. The second question is about the awareness of Germany in the global scenario, because Germany now has GDP with respect to global GDP is near 3%, using a purchasing power parity indicator. It was near 6% at the time of reunification. And in the same time, China moved from near 4% to the current 20%. So Germany is declining. Similarly, Europe and also Eurozone and Italy more in the global perspective. So what do you think about this global perspective, not only in terms of economic power, but also in terms of political and cultural power? The rise of China can play a role in convincing Germany to move in the right model, or according to your view is not so important? And finally, a more specific point on your presentation, and more generally the topic that you arise. You mentioned that, and I fully agree, the high costs of disgregation of the Eurozone. But maybe also some benefits and also costs, but also benefits for Germany to stay in the Eurozone are only partly investigated. I mentioned not only the well-known surplus in the current account of Germany, but also the role played by the dynamic of real exchange rate that is obviously related also to the surplus of the current account. What do you think about this point? Economists and also politicians in the European countries investigated enough this benefit for the German economy, or need something more also to move again on the right direction the German country that I agree with you is crucial and for the future of the European Monetary Union, but I think also for a future role of Germany in the global context.
How many hours do you give me?
2 minutes,
Well,
3 minutes.
First, Draghi, well, I think he is well aware of the constraints that Italy and the southern countries meet with the public debt. Whether he will be as efficient as in his new role in the Eurozone at large or not, I'm not sure. I think he was pretty powerful when he was governor of the European Central Bank. Now, as Prime Minister of Italy, he can play on his, let's say, role or on his on the trust that other countries have in him. But I mean, it depends very much on how the Italian economy is developing in these first years. And this, of course, depends not only on Italy, but as the interdependence between countries is so important, it depends also on what the other countries, and Germany and France, are doing. So I think he will have a tough job. Is Germany aware of the new changing scenario in the international context? Yes, I think it is aware, and it has got more aware in the recent times. They are planning huge investments. Let's take the automotive industry. Until before the pandemic, they didn't give a hint to the electric movement. Now they are investing hugely in these sectors. They are aware that they are behind in digital technology and all that. As for China, here again we have the two, let's say, parties towards China. They still think that China is very important as a market. So they don't like very much to cut their ties with China. Although they are aware that in this new international scenario, they cannot go alone. So they try to keep the European Union together to give not only economic, but also political force, strength, but they are still following their export-led model. And for that, they keep an eye very close to China. As for the costs of having Germany within the European Monetary Union, or let's say the benefits that Germany is having in terms of market, the export surplus, in terms of depreciation of the euro or the Deutschmark that they would have. Yes, I think that, I think that we can demonstrate with figures and models these facts, but you cannot convince Germany of the benefits that they have. I mean, yeah, they know that, but they would say, why don't you do like us? Nobody prevents you to export, become competitive, and all that. So unless you try to also work out the fact, as we have tried, I think, to show that a common area between different countries with the same rules doesn't lead to convergence. And even then, I don't think you can convince that, but we can try. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Let's try again with Nicola Acocella. If now with the iPad, maybe the situation is better. If not, at the moment, maybe not. So we move to...
Is it working?
Okay, Nicola.
Okay. Now my slides, the problem is with my slides. I don't have.
No problem, because the technician can share the slide, but if possible, you have
yes
your video. Okay now.
Okay. The problem is that someone can work with my slides.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. That's okay. Fine. So okay. So now the next one. Okay. that's a summary of I'm sorry, the summary of my contribution. The first two slides deal with some premises. One is about economic policy as a discipline, and the other is about the institutional, the EU and EMU institutions. Then I will derive the consequences of these institutions in the third slides and the following. To deal with and then deal with the impact of the pandemic and the novelties introduced by this pandemic into the EU institutions. Finally, to ask whether this is a provisional or a durable change of attitude. Next slide. So the first thing to recall is that economic policy is a discipline based on two pillars. Social choice theory, trying to deal with the way to pass from reference to social preferences. The second is to do with policy, seeing whether it is possible to manage the economy by the posters were mentioning just at the beginning of the 90s by Gennaro, and the pillar in the 70s. Then there was an evaluation by Matthias and first pillar, and saw myself and Di Bartolome in the 2000s.
Am I the only one who cannot really properly hear?
We cannot hear it perfectly. At the beginning was okay, Nicola, but now it's not really perfect.
Can't you hear well? Okay, I hope that my points are clear. Now it's to move from individual preferences to social preferences, and at the same time the government to manage the economy with no problems, not only in the short run, contrary to what everyone say, but in the medium and long run, contrary to what say. Next slide. Now, the institutional design and policies of the European institutions, these are very simple institutions. As far as the monetary union is concerned, there is practically only an active policy, a common currency, but no fiscal union, and limits set for each country's fiscal policy, which was first established by the Stability and Growth Pact, and then at the beginning of the 2010s by the Fiscal Compact. Practically, there were no rules for limiting current account imbalances. There were set different current account imbalances for surpluses and deficits, but even these were not, I'm sorry, the limits for surpluses were not obeyed too. Then for facing current account expenses, there is a very low budget, common budget, which until 2021 was only 1% of the EU GDP. So the design of EMU institutions was very simple, very simple until 2021. Next slide, please. Next slide. No. Oh, what were the inspiration of these institutions? The liberal attitude prevailing in the world at the time of the draft of the EMU, which was about the end of the 80s and early 90s. In addition, the German ordo-liberalism was important for this design, and these ideas were to a large extent imaged in the EMU institutions. Next slide, please. What was the consequence, or really what were the consequences? A number imbalances piled up before the financial crisis. On the one side, there were peripheral countries, prevailingly southern ones. On the other, core countries, Central and Northern European countries. These derived from the fact that the EMU institutions didn't tackle the pre-existing asymmetries, in particular the different inflation rates in the two groups of countries. This caused speculation and bubbles in the peripheral countries. The EMU institutions had an attitude of benign neglect. These current, and there were current account imbalances, deficits in the peripheral zones, which were matched by capital movements. And these capital movements made equalized current account imbalances, and all seemed to work well until the financial crisis. When the financial crisis erupted, there was a capital movement reversal to the core country that reinforces the crisis. The peripheral countries really were in a bad situation. Next slide, please. Now, the impact of the pandemic and the provisions to face it. The pandemic has revived the financial crisis. But this time, there have been relevant interventions by the EU institutions. In particular, these were manifold, really, not only monetary and of similar kind, but in particular, the next generation EU, the creation of this next generation EU fund, which was very different from the previous one, because not only introduced some kind of fiscalization of expenses by the different countries, which were charged to the EU budget, that raised in a consistent way from 1%, as I said before, to about 2% of the European GDP, but also because some common loans debts by the issued by the European Union were created. This is really the first time when this happened. The impact of the provisions can be seen from figure 1. Next slide. Where we show along the horizontal axis the size of the shock caused by the epidemic in terms of percentage of changes in GDP from autumn 2019 to spring 21. To spring 2020. The vertical axis measures instead the funds provisions in percentage of the country's net national income. For Italy, they should be around 6%, whereas the size of the shock, next slide please, is about 10%. You can see Italy along the 10% horizontal axis. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, we can come back to the previous slide, please, to show, to have an idea what happened to other countries. France had also an important contribution, but only 2%, even if it was hit by a shock of 9.5%. Spain was hit by 11%, about 11% shock, and had a very high contribution with respect to its GDP. Next slide, please. So, specific recommendations for each country and each country. And in addition, some of the tools that have been created were suspended. That was SGP, the Stability Effect, suspended until the end of next year. This ability to transform part national debt into European debt was
Nicola, we have again some problem to hear you.
Other, I hear you well, and I that the same is the words. You hear me?
Not perfectly. So maybe you can approach to your conclusion if you can.
So, the next figure, next time will show the expected effects. See that one thing can that the effects for the cumulative effects of the next generation fund be higher for Portugal and Spain, a bit lower for Italy. You can hear.
So, Nicola, we have a real difficulty to hear you. I think we have, unfortunately, we have to stop because it's difficult to understand what you are saying. So I think it's better if now I invite Enrico Marelli for a short discussion of your presentation. Enrico?
I can't hear you well. I can't hear you well.
Enrico, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that okay?
I have just 2-3 slides, but only 4 minutes. Okay. Well, I'm sorry that there were some technical problems with Nicola's paper, but it was really appealing and stimulating. I think the slides have circulated among us so you can see them. There was, as you have seen, an initial part about theory and institutional aspects, but I will focus, because of time limitations, on the empirical part, concerning the past, the present, and the future. Relative to the past, the focus of the paper was on the asymmetries, for example, higher inflation rates in the periphery, and current account imbalances that were so crucial before and during the financial crisis. I agree with this point, but I observe that in the last decade, the situation a little bit changed. For example, you know, in Italy, we had current account surpluses since 2013. And in the last decade, the inflation rate has been lower than the European average. So the real problem concerning Italy and other countries is the low growth rate due to the lack of investment, to the lack of aggregate demand, and especially internal demand, because exports are not so bad. So it is not really a problem of competitivity. It is a problem of internal demand, public expenditure, and investment, and so on. And as you know, the problem, a big problem of stagnant productivity. Concerning the present, after the striking impact of the pandemic, and we have seen it in the last graph shown by Nicola, the response of the European Union has been different, very different from the previous ones, to quote what is written in the paper. Thanks to this response, in 2021, this year, the recovery will be robust. And the current forecasts are for a rate of growth of about 5% this year. Concerning next years, in the paper, Nicola reports the estimates of Codogno, but I will quote here the official figures published in the Programma Nazionale di Riforma e Resilienza, according to which additional growth rate will be about 3.6% cumulated at the end of the period. But the doubts concern potential growth rate, because according to the official document, the annual potential growth will be increased by 0.8% each year. And this comes from additional 0.5 coming from the investments and additional 0.3 coming from the structural reforms. Well, there were many doubts, as in particular concerning structural reforms. First of all, we don't know if they will be really completed, and their impact is really uncertain. The future, the final part of the paper by Nicola refers to the possible perspectives in the next year concerning the European Union. The big question here is the current change of attitude provisional or durable? Will the new line of conduct be followed by a retreat or a relaunch of the European Union? These are the two questions raised in the final slide by Nicola. I agree with him that the answer is quite difficult. And I think in particular, it is too early to imagine an European Hamiltonian moment. Probably it will come some year in future. But I think anyway that this European Union we've seen last year has certainly progressed compared to 10 years ago. You remember the too little too late approach, austerity and so on. Another key element besides the new fiscal policy will concern the monetary policy. Nicola doesn't talk about it, but I think it is important to see what the European Central Bank will do in the next future. For example, the investments of sovereign bonds will continue how long? Forever, who knows? In this case, the help by the monetary policy will be quite important. Well, I think that such practical questions are important for the present life of European citizens. I finish here. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Enrico. And now I invited Donatella Saccone, University of Pollenzo and the Turing Center on Emerging Economies, for the last presentation that will be about the public investment multiplier, empirical evidence for European Union countries and policy implications. Please, Donatella.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Marcello, for the introduction. So I know that we are late, so I will try to stay in 10, maximum 15 minutes. And I will start from the rationale of our analysis, as we moved from the fact that in the extant literature there are numerous studies on estimating the multipliers for total public expenditure, but just few studies try to estimate the public investment multipliers. This is notwithstanding the crucial role that public investment has been proven to have, because the few studies estimating the multipliers for public investment show that actually public investment has higher multipliers with respect to other components of public spending, as well as better capacity to expand output and productivity in the long run. By the way, recently, this crucial role of public investment has also been recognized by international institutions like IMF and the European Commission, and even more recently by the well-known European investment plans as a response to the pandemic recession. And then the political debate has increasingly focused on the allocation of public resources. And then the research question that has become relevant is which categories of public investment have the highest and most persistent multiplicative effects on GDP. However, there's no empirical evidence about this fact. And then the contribution of our analysis is estimating multipliers of public investment, which are classified in 10 different functions of government, with the final aim of informing the discussion about fiscal allocation of public resources. For the empirical analysis, we took data from Eurostat, which provides the value of public investment in 10 functions of government according to the international standard classification. And then we collected yearly data for 31 European countries observed over the period 1995-2019. Unfortunately, quarterly data were not available, so the period that we observed was quite short. The 10 functions of government that we took into account are general public services, defense, public order and safety, economic affairs, environmental protection, housing and community amenities, health, recreation, culture and religion, education and social protection. I don't want to bother you with too much technical details, also because it's almost lunchtime, but I need to give you some information about the methodology that we followed. And in order to estimate the multipliers of public investment, we relied on the local projections method. That is a method originally introduced in 2005 and then largely adopted by the literature on fiscal multipliers because of its advantages if compared to the more traditional structural vector autoregressive models, as they avoid dynamic restrictions and complex specifications, and as a consequence are less sensitive to misspecification and also easily to be estimated. Basically, the idea is to estimate 8 regressions, one for each forecast horizon, where the impulse response functions are obtained through projecting the macroeconomic variable of interest, in our case, the change in GDP, on past values of the fiscal variable. In our case, as you can see in the equation, the rate of growth of public investment. We started from a very baseline model, taking inspiration from the lady and other authors, where you can see in the equation the response of GDP at each horizon is modeled as a function of a change in the rate of growth of total public investment at time t. And then, and this is the novelty of the analysis, we broke down public investment in the 10 functions of government, and basically we estimated 10 different models, one for each function of government. Before presenting the results, I just want to underline that we discussed about the possibility that reverse causality exists. Indeed, public spending and also its single components as a consequence could be partially determined by the contemporaneous variation of GDP. The literature agrees on the fact that this is unlikely to happen within the same quarter, but we dealt with yearly data, and then it may represent a problem. Previous literature provided some arguments excluding endogeneity of public investment, because as the lady and other authors underlined, we must say that in presence of cyclical fluctuation of GDP, usually monetary policies are preferred because they are quicker to be implemented and require shorter institutional, bureaucratic and technical decisions. By the way, previous literature also provided some evidence against reverse causality, but we wanted to check that. And then we regressed the early rate of growth of public investment on the contemporaneous GDP growth. And to do that, we instrumented GDP growth by the US weighted economic growth, as suggested by Panizza and Jajmowicz. I don't have time to enter into details, but if you want additional additional details I can give them during the discussion. I prefer to move to the results. And here I reported the results from the first set of regressions that we ran. And you can see, first of all, that total public investment as a whole has a significant and persistent multiplicative effect on GDP growth. And by the way, the values that we found are quite in line with the values estimated by previous works. And this reassures us about the reliability of the estimates when we broke down the investment by functions of government. And then here you can also find the estimated multipliers for each of the functions of government that resulted to have a significant effect on GDP. They are economic affairs, education, housing and community amenities, public order and safety, and general public services. The dashed lines represent the 95% confidence interval. Then we try to check if our results are robust to the adoption of different specifications and samples. At first, we put all the 10 categories of public investment jointly in the same regression, as they are part of the same fiscal package, and then we wanted to study the joint effect and to see if it affects the results. Then we added a set of control variables selected on the basis of existent literature. And finally, we used random resampling to see if results changed with the samples. What emerged is that the persistent and robust multiplicative effects that we previously found are confirmed just for total public investment as a whole, and then for three functions of government: economic affairs, education, and general public services. While for the other function, for the investment in the other functions of government, we did not find any significant effect. This does not mean that public investment in the other sectors did not have any effect in any country, but this means that on average, our data did not capture any regularity in their effect. Finally, we also checked if results changed when different growth regimes are studied, because the previous literature has shown how actually the multiplicative effect of fiscal policy is higher and also more statistically significant under periods of low growth and recession. And then we verified that. In order to do that, we approximated the two states of the economy, high and low growth, using alternative methods, but especially we exploited the fact that at the time span that we considered, there was the Great Recession. And then we used the Great Recession as a breaking point, and we split the data set in two different subperiods: 1995 to 7, and then 2008 and 2019. And the results that emerged from this last set of regression were quite interesting, because first of all, for total public investment as a whole, and also for economic affairs, education, and general public services, which are the sectors in which public investment resulted to have a significant and persistent effect, it emerges that actually this persistent effect is mainly due to the positive effect on GDP that public investment had during the low growth regime, while during the high growth regime, so in the first sub-period, actually the effect was significant just at the first horizons. And then another result that emerged from this last set of regression is that also public investments in public order and safety and health turn out to have a significant multiplicative effect, again under the low growth regime. So this basically confirms the results of previous literature regarding the fact that public investment have higher multipliers under low growth regime, but it put in evidence this fact for specific categories of public investment. So what can we conclude from our analysis? As I underlined, when we check for the robustness of the results, total public investment is confirmed to have higher multipliers. We checked also the value of public multipliers for the residual public spending, and we found that actually public investment has the highest multipliers. But this is particularly true when public investment is used to support the creation of human capital and the functioning of economic affairs and general public services. It's worth underlining that general public services also include basic R&D and the functioning of public institutions. Then, under periods of low growth, the multipliers are confirmed to be larger and significant also when resources are invested in other functions of government and specifically in the promotion of health and of public order and safety. These findings can be important in the debate on the role that public investment can have in accelerating the post-pandemic recovery. We also discussed some further extension of our analysis, as in the analysis we mainly treated public investment, the different categories of public investment as separate, while actually public investments are part of the same package of fiscal policy, and then it could be interesting also to study how they interact, and especially if there are trade-offs and synergies across the different categories of public investment. Finally, there's a point that I want to underline because it's important in my opinion, and it is that the fact that we did not find any significant and persistent multiplicative effect for public investment in environmental and social protection does not mean at all, of course, that governments should not invest there. Why? Simply because they are considered crucial sectors for fostering sustainable development, as also underlined by the European Commission in the context of the Next Generation EU guidelines with the principle do no significant harm. And this means that this consideration calls for new investigation on the effects that different categories of investment not only have on strictly economic variables, but also on social and the environmental targets that are mentioned in the Agenda 2030. So I think I concluded. So Marcello,
thanks,
I took time, 15 minutes.
Perfect.
So thank you for the attention, and I'm fully available.
We used all the time. So I just conclude by thanking all the presenters and discussants, but I like to summarize the four presentations in a very simple sentence that is the following: history, institution, economics, and last but not least, politics are all crucial for better understanding a complex dynamic reality, and also to suggest possible economic policies for a better Europe for the next generation. In our view, to have a stronger Europe is also an instrument to have a better global dimension, not only a better Italy, a better Europe. Also, the cultural and political aspects are crucial in the global scenario. Thank you very much to everybody. In 15 minutes, the Villa Mondragone International Economic Seminar will continue. I don't know if Professor Paganetto want to add something.
Thank you again for the very interesting session. And let me say that I have a bit of experience on the topic that we discussed, and I learned a lot. So this is the proof that for me that the session has been very interesting. Thank you. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk with you, with Anna Maria Simonazzi, with Donato Masciandano, Pompeo della Posta, Enrico Marelli, Donatella Saccone. Thank you again, and we'll be in touch for the book that you are intending to publish, but this is a different story. Anyway, thank you again.
Thanks.
Bye, bye, bye.
Bye, bye.
Bye.
Ciao.